Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Is the mic working? Great. I want to apologize in advance because I appear to be doing two things that are atypical in Wisconsin. I am wearing a tie, and I am also reading from something that I wrote. So bear with me. They don't let us out of the ivory tower very much, despite what Phil said. The story that I want to start telling today is the story of the Jewish villain in American literature, film, and popular culture. It's a complex story, one that mixes Jewish anxieties and Jewish pride, and which exposes a web of ambivalence and continued uncertainty about how Jews should engage with money, violence, and power, but especially with money. It strikes me, however, that at least part of the story of Jewish villains in America is oddly the story of two men named Meyers, and the story of how we respond and interpret two scenes. Scene A, F. Scott Fitzgerald's 1925 novel, The Great Gatsby. Nick Carraway meets Jay Gatsby in a well-fanned 42nd Street cellar. Carraway arrives to find Gatsby in conversation with another man, Meyer Wolfsheim. We learn that Wolfsheim is Gatsby's business partner, though the details of their relationship are unspecified. At the end of the scene, Carraway, already disgusted, learns that Wolfsheim is a gambler, the man who fixed the 1919 World Series. I would have thought of it as a thing that merely happened, the end of some inevitable chain. It never occurred to me that one man could start to play with the faith of 50 million people with the single-mindedness of a burglar blowing a safe. So before I say a word or two about this, I'm curious if you have any impressions of this passage, if there are words that might jump out at you. Yes?
How one man can change history. Or
Yeah.
one person, not a man, but how one person can change history. And in baseball, you had to have a whole new commissioner. You had to have the whole game change because of the Black Sox.
Right. So let's take a look at that one man for a second. Does that strike any particular, does it have any resonances within a Jewish world, within a Jewish context? Well, sure. Well, we're before Hitler. So we're for Hitler, so that can't be. But what about the idea of one man standing by? Yes?
Meyer Lansky.
Right, Meyer Lansky, sure. But the idea is that there's one man standing behind, right? That there's an idea of one person standing behind a conspiracy.
Pharaoh.
Sure. I like it.
And Shapatsi.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
You might as well go to Bernard Madoff.
Well, maybe we will. But if you, yes, please.
I think there's a sense of undermining
Yes.
the culture of which one is and isn't a part.
Absolutely.
And the individual greed subverting a larger sense of community and a larger enterprise. And at risk of overdoing it, I think it's kind of a Judas figure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that you're on all the right tracks here. One man standing behind a conspiracy to undermine this institution is awfully close to the idea of Jews controlling the economy and manipulating how the economy works from behind the scenes. Absolutely. And second, there's that interesting word that Fitzgerald uses here. He says one man could play with the faith, right, of 50 million people. Right. So what does faith seem to tell us? What does that suggest? Trust, belief, and what else? Religion. Right, exactly. That this is the Jew who's come in to this a Christian society, and that he is playing with the faith of 50 million people. And what's even more impressive is this final line, this single-mindedness of a burglar blowing a safe. Because to Nick Carraway, who's this representative of the WASP ideal, this is unimaginable. But what he's saying is that this is just only the routine workaday business of someone like Rothstein, of the Jew. It kind of simultaneously expresses awe and ease. That's a very strange set of nonchalance that's here. Yeah, one final question before we move on.
Yeah, from a different point, somewhat different point of view also, it appears to me this guy is maybe jealous because he didn't think about it.
It's an interesting question whether Carraway is jealous. I don't think so. You'd have to do a lot of work in the novel. But I do think that one thing that you could say is that there is a fear that the WASP elite has in the book that they are now being left out of this newly forming society. That this newly forming society has more to do with money than with lineage, and that they need money just as much as anyone else does. So, scene B, Meyer-Lansky at the airport. In 1970, Meyer-Lansky attempted to retire to Israel. He claimed citizenship under the law of return. But Lansky's claim was immediately challenged under the clause that he might pose a danger to the state of Israel. Lansky at the time was 68 years old, so there's plenty of time for all of you to pose a danger to the state of Israel. Lansky's legal case took 20 months to resolve, largely because of the pressure that the US government exerted on Israel not to grant Lansky citizenship. The US intended to try Lansky for numerous crimes, most prominently tax evasion. On November 7th, 1972, Lansky was arrested at the Miami airport. "It's too late to worry," Lansky said. "What will be, will be. A Jew has a slim chance in the world." Now, Lansky was released on bail. The government never brought any serious charges. I can't decide whether we should think of these two scenes, scene A and B, as sequels or opposites. These scenes embody striking contradictions. They layer Jewish taboos, fears, fascinations, but also pride. In scene A, Meyer Wolfsheim, the parvenu Jew, is excluded as not quite American. Nick Carraway, the representative of the WASP ideal, reviles everything that Wolfsheim represents. Yet this revulsion and exclusion is precisely the reason that some have come to lionize Jewish gamblers and gangsters. With cinematic clarity, the writer Rich Cohen described these early century Jews as, quote, trying to burst into the palace with a crowbar. The image is vivid. Jobs and status denied them. These Jews stormed the gates. When Prohibition imposed a very particular vision of morality on America, Jewish gangsters did what the invisible hand of the market dictated. They became smugglers and bootleggers. In scene B, Lansky, who made his initial fortune and reputation in bootlegging, is told that he must stay in America. Americanness is no longer excluded. Americanness is imposed. Decades earlier, the US government exiled Lansky's partner, Lucky Luciano, to Sicily. Now, the stream of morality that excluded Wolfsheim compels Lansky's inclusion. It demands that the Jew remain an American, if only long enough to stand trial. Yet scene B also stands out as one of the more fantastic moments in the problematic history of Jewish identity. Is Israel a Jewish state? Is it still a site of refuge for all Jews? Or is it bound by the necessities of statecraft, the need to appease higher powers like the United States? How does the American Jew define himself via Israel? What did Israel mean to Meyer Lansky, who came to America from Poland as a small child, whose parents chose to immigrate to New York instead of Palestine for economic reasons? Lansky was a man in search of a promised land, his own personal Zion. Lansky spearheaded the mob's adventures in Las Vegas, South Florida, and Cuba. He built what the historian Deborah Dash Moore has called the golden lands of American Jewry. Lansky and others built gaming empires to launder money and to grow more and more of it. But they also fulfilled and fueled middle-class dreams of holidays in the sun, escapes from the cold winds of Brooklyn, Chicago, and Wisconsin. In Israel, Lansky lived at the Don Hotel in Tel Aviv, on the Mediterranean coast. Was Tel Aviv meant to be just another sunshine resort, albeit his final one? Or was Israel the fulfillment of a half-suppressed yet lifelong dream of finding a promised land? The irony of Lansky at the airport transcends poetry and becomes myth. The Jew denied citizenship in the one place that promises citizenship to all Jews finds that being a Jew is the only explanation for this irony. A Jew has a slim chance in the world, he said. There, in a single sentence, is the absurdity of Jewish life in the 20th century. Now, my aim today is to study these men and these two scenes in some detail. I'm interested in the after-image of Lansky and Wolfsheim in literature and popular culture, how they appear and how their appearances change over time. Multiple books and movies tell the story of Meyer Lansky, whether as the basis for one of cinema's greatest villains, this is Hyman Roth in The Godfather Part 2, as a supporting role in the life of another gangster. Here we have Ben Kingsley playing him in Barry Levinson's Bugsy, or most recently as an elderly, vanquished version of himself in Zachary Lazar's novel, I Pity the Poor Immigrant. Likewise, The Great Gatsby has been adapted numerous times. Adaptation is a really curious art, somewhere between interpretation and creation. In adaptation, a current artist reconsiders older artistic expression. The present encounters and reuses the past. As such, adaptation becomes the stage for conflict, the confrontation of different sets of values. Who we are versus who we were. Who we are versus who we want to be. What we believed versus what we believe, and what we wished that we believed. Adaptation gives life to old stories, but in so doing, it raises questions of responsibility. What are our responsibilities as adapters? Can we revise some of the more noxious elements of books and movies we admire? Can we omit racism in order to bring books in line with our present standards? It's a question of that all adapters of The Great Gatsby have had to face. And with rare exception, Meyer Wolfsheim's Jewishness has been downplayed and anti-Semitism written out of the story. Yet, as I've already indicated, the narrative needs Wolfsheim's Jewishness. It needs the Jewish villain to repel Nick Carraway in order for the scene to work. Is removing Wolfsheim's Jewishness an artistically responsible position? And more importantly, is it responsible to history? As critically unfashionable as it may be to go back to writing about Fitzgerald's prejudice and stereotypes in the novel, ignorance and avoidance are even worse strategies. Omitting anti-Jewish prejudice in Gatsby only absolves Fitzgerald of his actual prejudice and continues his transformation into the drunken saint of American decadence. Now, earlier I said that I could not decide whether Scene A and Scene B were sequels or opposites, whether the stories of Wolfsheim and Lansky were installments in the same series, or if one reverses the other. There's no question, however, that the memory of these two stories have diverged. While Wolfsheim's Jewishness has been downplayed and omitted, Lansky's has been emphasized. In Bugsy, for example, to go back here, Ben Kingsley's Meyer Lansky speaks with an Eastern European accent. He metaphorically shuns the spotlight, which the filmmakers visualize by cloaking him in darkness. And even here, we see him in a dark suit. We can tell that it's nighttime by the fact that there are lights on in the buildings that you can see behind the windows. It's a little hard to make out right now, but their curtains are drawn, even though it's night. It's a very thin curtain. So this is a person whose impulse is to retreat into the shadows. So even though it embraces the Jewishness that we've talked about, we're still dealing with the idea of one man behind the scenes, in this case being behind these drawn curtains. So Warren Beatty Siegel is described as completely irrational. Lansky is the definition of rationality. You could think of him as kind of the cool Litvak in this situation. Kingsley's Lansky is the most rational person in the room, but he's always defiantly Jewish. More importantly, the movie and other portrayals of Lansky are approving. They don't shy away from the villainy, the need to indulge in violence and other horrifying acts. Rich Cohen's Tough Jews, the source of the earlier quote about Jews trying to burst into the palace with a crowbar, is a fantastically entertaining book and a surreal act of hero worship. Cohen tells the story of his father's generation, Jews from Brooklyn who moved to the Midwest and Los Angeles, and who now gather at the deli to trade stories about the old neighborhood and the Jewish gangsters who were legends in their childhood. Jewish gangsters are symbols of strength. To me, Cohen writes, remembering Jewish gangsters is a good way to deal with being born after 1945, with being someone who always had the Holocaust at his back. The gangsters' violence represents the ability of Jews to fight back. It's a counter to the idea that Jews were helpless, and a counter to the Zionist argument that only the new Jew, that only the Sabra had strength. Here was another image, closer to home, Cohen writes. Jews with guns, tough, fearless Jews, anti-heroes whose very swagger seemed to provide another option. Lansky and Wolfsheim are modern myths. They become figures for what we want to see. We project on them different sets of ideas. As myths, the specific details of their lives are less important than the broad strokes. Lansky may have said, a Jew has a slim chance in this world at the Miami airport, or he may have actually said it in Jerusalem, the moment that he found out that he wasn't going to gain citizenship. But by studying the shifting adaptations of these characters and the responses to them, we can understand how Jewish fears have shifted over the years. But I also want us to think at least a little about the elements of the story that we continue to minimize in modern-day portrayals of these criminals. What aspects of these stories continue to trouble us? What specific Jewish anxiety about money or power does the Jewish gangster point to? What stories do we still not want to tell? Well, The Great Gatsby has been made into a movie 4 times. And here are the 4 posters. It was and actually they're in reverse order. It was in 1926, that's the one all the way on the right, 1949, 1974, and 2013. I'm curious if people have seen different versions. Who has seen the 2013 version? Few people. The 1974 version? Yeah, a few more people. Has anyone seen the 1949 version? Oh, nice. That's actually very rare today. It's only very rarely screened, and no one has seen the 1926 version because it's lost. There's about 1 minute of it that exists. But if you have seen it, please let me know. And also, you're probably a character in Steve Stern's book, The Pinch. Now, there was also a made-for-TV movie in the year 2000 starring Mira Sorvino as Daisy. And oddly, of all of the Great Gatsby movies, this might be the best one for reasons that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, Meyer Wolfsheim does not appear in either of the first 2 movies. In 1926, the character was just completely omitted. They focused mostly on the Jazz Age and the ideas of partying. In the 1949 version, Meyer Wolfsheim was replaced by an Irish character named Myron Lupus. So it's only in the TV version was Wolfsheim, only in the TV version and the 1974 version was Wolfsheim actually played by a Jewish actor. Now, the creative process that preceded Baz Luhrmann's 2013 3D version of Gatsby is particularly noteworthy. Luhrmann's Gatsby was unalloyed spectacle, possibly the brightest movie ever filmed. It was also deeply, deeply strange. At times, Luhrmann and his co-screenwriter Craig Pierce are almost slavish in their fidelity to the novel. They were determined to find a way to visualize even the most minute details of Fitzgerald's prose. In one of the most famous lines, Carraway says, "Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It was what preyed on Gatsby. What foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men." Now, some critics explain foul dust as in part an allusion to the Valley of Ashes that divides New York and Long Island. If you've read the book or seen any of the movies, you'll remember this as a very important point. But Luhrmann, and perhaps his smartest move as an adapter of Gatsby, connected this imagery to the Jewish villain, Meyer Wolfsheim. So here we see Meyer Wolfsheim's face emerge out of a cloud of smoke or steam, out of a cloud of foul dust. Now, Wolfsheim, in this version, is clearly what preys on Gatsby, a word that invokes the most primal, historic, and fantastic fears of the Jewish villain. Luhrmann otherwise completely wrote out Meyer Wolfsheim's Jewishness. Consider Wolfsheim's appearance. This is how Wolfsheim appears in the novel. A small, flat-nosed Jew raised his large head and regarded me with 2 fine growths of hair, which luxuriated in either nostril. After a moment, I discovered his tiny eyes in the half-darkness. Now, Fitzgerald's prose is detailed, though also vague enough to give Luhrmann and his casting directors some flexibility. The casting notes should still call for a Jewish-looking actor, but Luhrmann and his casting directors are otherwise free to decide which of Fitzgerald's adjectives to emphasize. Luhrmann could, for example, find a Jewish-looking actor with a large head and tiny eyes, or Luhrmann could choose to degroom his Wolfsheim, to leave him with unplucked forests of hair growing out of each nostril. The one thing that Luhrmann and his casting directors should not have done, if we're judging by the description in the text, is to cast someone with an impeccably manicured beard, which is, of course, precisely what they did. Baz Luhrmann's Wolfsheim is obsessed with grooming. Luhrmann and his co-screenwriter, Craig Pierce, replaced the 42nd Street cellar of the book with a speakeasy, one whose legitimate front is a barber shop. We not only first encounter Wolfsheim at the barber shop, we meet him in the barber's chair. So the smoke, the foul dust, was actually talcum powder that had been done after the cut. Fine growths of hair may indeed threaten to descend from this man's nostrils, but this Wolfsheim will never allow them to appear. Not to Caraway, not to anyone else. If nose hair is a mark of Jewishness, which as I get older I discover it is, then Wolfsheim is a Jew who is actively working to erase his ethnic identity. Now, there's actually a fascinating dialogue going on here, some of which we kind of heard about this morning. One of the main fixations of the American Jewish culture in the first half of the 20th century was passing, being seen as an ordinary American. Actors changed their names, and they worked to obliterate all traces of their accents. Businessmen dressed in fine clothing and adopted the mannerisms of the business elite. Passing is precisely what's at stake in The Great Gatsby. Caraway, Fitzgerald's narrator, refuses to allow the Jew to pass unnoticed into the respectable world. Now, the irony here, of course, is that Gatsby is also passing. But Gatsby is allowed to pass into the society. Caraway is obsessed with Wolfsheim's nose, and Caraway seizes on Wolfsheim's mistakes, and the nose and the mistakes are really the same thing. His nostrils turn to me in an interested way, Caraway says before quoting Wolfsheim. I understand you're looking for a business connection. On the next page, Wolfsheim repeatedly mispronounces Oxford as Ogsford. Now, it's actually really hard to mispronounce Oxford as Ogsford and connection as connection. It requires totally shifting where you form these sounds and moving from open vowels to the close. These are entirely nasal sounds. I'm not going to ask you to do this right now, but in your spare time, you might practice, and you'll see that you have to form it in the back of the palate. So maybe it would have been best if they had simply cast an actor with a prominent nose, one that could be made to dominate his face under the right kind of lighting and framing. Luhrmann's Wolfsheim is instead a vague Oriental other. The smoke, the talcum powder that surrounds Wolfsheim, it more immediately evokes Orientalist fantasies than it does Fitzgerald's line about foul dust. Luhrmann's Wolfsheim taps into fears of Arabs and Middle Eastern immigrants, not fears of the Jew. But as I said before, this Wolfsheim resides in a speakeasy. The speakeasy is a phantasmagoria. It brings together people of different races and backgrounds. Part of the bite of Fitzgerald's prose is the particular way that Caraway refuses to allow Wolfsheim to pass. Luhrmann's Wolfsheim doesn't need to pass into any kind of society. America is changing to accommodate him. 1974's portrayal of Wolfsheim is even more surreal. Though they share some of the same dialogue, we would have a hard time finding a family resemblance between Luhrmann's Wolfsheim and the version played by Howard Da Silva in Jack Clayton's star-studded Flop. De Silva, who's actually, this is a stage name, he's Jewish. It says something that the stage name he chose was Italian, perhaps because he felt he had an ethnic look. De Silva plays Wolfsheim as a sweaty, beloved Jewish raconteur, and I'm just going to play a very quick clip.
Have you known Gatsby for a long time?
Known him. I made him. I made the pleasure of his acquaintance just after the war. He was so hard up, he had to keep on wearing his uniform because he couldn't buy regular clothes. But I said to myself, that's the kind of man you'd like to bring home, introduce to your mother and your sister. I see you're looking at my cuff buttons. Find a specimen of human molars.
Well, that's a very interesting idea.
Yes.
Were you and Mr. Rosenthal close friends?
Think like that and everything.
I'm sorry.
What's to be sorry? Let us learn to show our friendship for a man when he's alive, not after he's dead. After that, my own rule is to let everything alone.
Everything's taken care of.
Ah, I enjoyed my lunch.
Don't hurry, Meyer.
No, you're very polite, but I belong to another generation. You sit here and discuss your sports and your young ladies and your... As for me, I'm 60 years old, and I won't impose myself on you any longer.
He becomes very sentimental sometimes.
Okay, let's stop there. I'm curious, when you watch this, do any of you think villain and evil? No. What do you think? What does the performance make you feel?
He's a fool.
He's a fool. Okay.
And I don't think he was Jewish.
You don't think of him as Jewish. Right. So not identifiably Jewish and possibly foolish. What else? Yes?
I think he's a big-time gangster that he has people's teeth for those.
Yeah, so there is still that detail about the cuff buttons, which is taken directly from the book. And the cuff buttons are interesting because one thing that we'll look at a little bit later, albeit very, very briefly, is that there was an association sometimes in the imagery of Jews and vampires. And you even see this in the idea of the Jew as the bloodsucker. And so the cuff button really just very casually evokes that. But what about the tone of this scene? What's really interesting here is the fact that one thing that I found fascinating is how sweaty Wolfsheim is, right? There's a sort of glistening of sweat that surrounds him. And it seems to be combined with this idea of being a little bit older and being of a different time and place. But what he does is he gives mentorship, right? He gives sage advice. The advice to Carraway that he value his friends when they live and not when they're gone is actually in the book. But it comes at the end of the novel, when Carraway begs Wolfsheim to come to Gatsby's funeral. The effect of putting the dialogue here is to bond us to Wolfsheim. Given the purpose of the scene in the novel, the screenplay and De Silva's portrayal are surreal, though perhaps also directly inspired by their moment in time. We have to remember that this is from 1974. In the 1970s, one of the most assertively Jewish decades in American cultural history, Jews were more likely to be celebrated for their shtick than seen as figures of menace. So I would just point out a couple of additional mannerisms. The exaggerated way that this Wolfsheim says sports, the way he rushed through, he's saying 60 years old, the way he grabbed his hat and bid adieu. It's this idea of an older gentleman leaving the scene for younger gentlemen rather than anything else. Sam Waterston's Nick Carraway even smiled a little when Wolfsheim walks away. So we've recast the Jewish villain as the kindly old world grandfather. And yet, Clayton and De Silva's Wolfsheim is even more remarkable when we contextualize him. De Silva defanged Wolfsheim the same exact year that Lee Strasberg created the screen's most indelible, most conniving, and least trustworthy Jewish villain, Hyman Roth. I'm sorry, that seems to... There we go. Now, even motionless and inert, Strasberg exudes evil. You get this sense of coiled strength. There's something inside of him that he's trying to suppress and not let out. As I said earlier, Hyman Roth is a thinly disguised version of Meyer Lansky. Like Lansky, Roth dreams of Cuba. Like Lansky, Roth outwardly lives the life of a Jewish American grandfather. He has an ordinary home in South Florida. And this is Hyman Roth's neighborhood and Meyer Lansky's real home in South Florida. Perhaps like Meyer Lansky, he even donated to his synagogue. But Hyman Roth and Meyer Lansky's inner lives were unknowable and dark. Strasberg's Roth is the heir to Shylock and Wolfsheim. Like Shylock, Hyman Roth's great love is money. In a nod to Wolfsheim, he speaks with pride about the fact that Arnold Rothstein fixed the World Series. Hyman Roth is Michael Corleone's opposite. Do we have Godfather fans in the room? Yes? Okay, good. The Godfather Part 2 poses two central questions. Can Michael Corleone avoid becoming his father? And are there values higher than money? Michael lives in a world where family, honor, ethnicity, and duty are ultimately all more important than money. Hyman Roth lives in a world where money and business are the highest virtues. The movie asks, can Italians work as equals with Jews? Can races work together? Roth's answer is yes. Money trumps all of these boundaries. Michael's answer is ultimately no. Family and tribal loyalty often come first. Now, when Michael Corleone wants to know what happened to one of his associates, a member of his crime family, Hyman Roth tells him the story of his friend Moe Green as a parable. Green was a dreamer who came up with the idea of founding Las Vegas. Green is Bugsy Siegel to Hyman Roth's Meyer Lansky. Green was killed for something that happened in Vegas. And here I'll show another brief clip.
Fortune.
Sorry, I'm just going to the
And
exact
trusted
spot.
him. Out of a desert stopover was Las Vegas. And there isn't even a plaque or a signpost or a statue of him in that town. Someone put a bullet through his eye. No one knows who gave the order. When I heard it, wasn't angry. I knew Moe. I knew he was headstrong, talking loud, saying stupid things. So when he turned up dead, I let it go. And I said to myself, this is the business we've chosen. I didn't ask who gave the order, because it had nothing to do with business.
But that's what his world comes down to, business. Even when faced with the fact that his close friend had died, which was a murder that Michael had actually ordered at the end of the first movie, even when faced with this fact, the one thing that matters is business. The first thing that we learn about Hyman Roth in the movie is Hyman Roth always makes money for his partners. One by one, our old friends are gone. Hyman Roth is the only one left because he always made money for his partners. Hyman Roth's true evil is corrupting Michael's brother, Fredo, convincing Fredo to choose money over family. The Jewish villain preys on Fredo's weakness. Now, Roth meets his end at the Miami airport. Like Lansky, he's denied citizenship in Israel. Like Lee Harvey Oswald, Roth is shot by a figure who suddenly emerged out of the crowd. Now, here, as well as in real life, the denial of Israeli citizenship exposes Roth, leaves him vulnerable to his enemies. The Miami airport is Roth's literal end. With hindsight, we see that the film and reality both reach the level of mythic irony. The law of return exists to protect Jews from persecution, to shield Jews from oppressive governments and threatened violence. Alleged criminality becomes an excuse to deny protections owed the Jew, and in both cases, the Jew meets his end as a result. A Jew has a slim chance in this world. Now, as I said before, The Godfather 1 and The Great Gatsby were both released in the same year. Amazingly, we can actually credit this dualist vision of the Jew villain to a single person, Francis Ford Coppola. Coppola wrote the screenplay for both The Great Gatsby and The Godfather Part 2. Perhaps Coppola was confused because his time was confused. Perhaps he is saying that the Jew cannot be the sole figure of evil in a text. Hyman Roth is a cost of doing business. He belongs in a mob movie. Meyer Wolfsheim was not a cost of doing business. Or perhaps Wolfsheim was intentionally watered down to highlight Hyman Roth's duplicity. Coppola's Wolfsheim is exactly what Hyman Roth pretends to be, the father figure, the mentor. Yet it's also worth considering the idea that Coppola, in seeking to create and reimagine new Jewish villains, is here answering the call once issued by Leslie Fiedler in Commentary magazine. For Fiedler, and perhaps for Coppola, the only response to the Jewish villain was the creation of multiple ideas of Jewish villainy, multiple visions of Shylock and Fagin and Wolfsheim, multiple ideas of what the Jew could be. What now strikes us as surreal cognitive dissonance was perhaps the only artistically responsible response to the legacy of the Jew villain in English literature, to the presence of this symbol of hatred in works they found beautiful, even sublime. Leslie Fiedler's article, What Can We Do About Fagin, the Jew villain in the Western tradition, was published in Commentary in May 1949. Leslie Fiedler was born in Newark, New Jersey, and attended college at the Bronx campus of NYU, but I'm happy to say he got some sense into him, and his PhD is from here, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, in English. What Can We Do About Fagin came at a critical moment in Fiedler's intellectual life. After studying to be a medievalist, Fiedler began to write about American literature after World War II. The articles that Fiedler wrote in the 1940s are some of the first major essays to study race, gender, and sexuality in American literature. What Can We Do About Fagin continues this project. In a sense, it's almost the most important of his essays. It's the moment when Fiedler decided not to retreat and opted instead to embrace this new direction on his scholarly life and to focus on topics that might be considered taboo or uncomfortable. The article galvanized his whole generation of Jewish intellectuals. Fiedler was the leading critic of American literature in the 1960s and the 1970s, exactly the figure that someone trying to work through the thorny history of Jewish villains would turn to for guidance and inspiration. We can divide Fiedler's essay into three parts. First, Fiedler explains the central issue. Let us know clearly that if we want to call the culture in which we live our own, we will have to come to terms with a believed-in monster, a symbol of darkness whose name we share. The issue, in other words, is precisely the fact that Jews feel themselves to be both Americans and Jews, and yet they find themselves excluded by this Western tradition that they had previously believed to be their own. Jews are called monsters in its foundational works. Second, Fiedler argues that fear of the Jew is at its core fear of circumcision, which is in turn a fear of castration. We might disagree with Fiedler here, but it is what he said, so I wanted to put that out there. Even the standard atrocity attributed to the Jew, the ritual murder of a child, is a rationalization of that original nightmare of the circumciser, ritual blade in hand, Fiedler writes in the article. Finally, Fiedler argues that censorship and omission are the worst solutions to the problem of Fagin. He instead proposed two solutions. One, kidnapping the myth, that is, reinterpreting it, reading into it more sympathetic meanings. And two, surrounding the Jew with new extensive mythic imagery. Fiedler closed the article by saying that in the new post-war America, a time of universal alienation and atomic anxiety, that the Jew was becoming the symbol of everyone. Here we might think of Kafka's K and the embrace of Kafka in post-war America, or James Joyce's Bloom, and then much later, Philip Roth's Alexander Portnoy. We might also think of Howard de Silva's Wolfsheim as trying to kidnap the myth by muting the character and making him more of a beloved figure. But the conclusions of Fiedler's essay are as striking as his critical practice. Fiedler was actually on assignment for Commentary magazine. Fagin was not a free-floating symbol. Fiedler was asked to respond to David Lean's 1948 adaptation of Oliver Twist. Lean's Fagin, played by Alec Guinness, is perhaps the most shocking example of immediate post-war anti-Semitism, a beautiful, dark, twisted fantasy of Jewish evil. In March 1949, David Lean's film was screened in the area of Berlin under British control. The Jews of Berlin, most of them Holocaust refugees, protested the first screening. Police came to break up the protest, and it soon turned violent. Here's how Life magazine described what happened. The pictures from Berlin last week were like photographs from an old nightmare. Here again, as there had been a decade ago, were club-swinging police and mauled and battered Jews. The theater tried to screen the movie again the next day, and another riot ensued. The movie was withdrawn. The British press was livid. The Telegraph claimed that British prestige had suffered by allowing the film to be twice forced off the screen by an organized demonstration of, quote, a handful of foreigners. So anti-Semitism bleeds through every element of this description. Life ended their article by saying, it was hard to see why the producers insisted on such complete fidelity, and it was harder still to guess why the authorities permitted exhibition in Germany. Now, the American Jew was coming to terms with the fact that the war had only repressed anti-Semitism. It hadn't killed it, nor could it ever have killed anti-Semitism. Lean's movie clearly shows us two things. One, the distance between America and England when it comes to attitudes towards the Jew. In America, we had gentlemen's agreement. In the UK, they had Fagin. Second, that we do need to consider the time and place of art. Even if Fagin points to certain innate human evil, an evil that transcends Jewishness, even if Fagin is a figure for the darkness of the soul, we still need to understand where and when it's appropriate to tell those stories. American Jews fought against these characters. As I said before, the 1949 version of The Great Gatsby made Meyer Wolfsheim Irish. Given that moment in history, the decision was more responsible than staying closer to the text, than trying to realize the author's work. 21st century America might be ready for a nuanced Jewish villain. Mid-century England was not. But there was one important approach to the Jewish villain that Fiedler never seriously considered: mockery. Fiedler never imagined that the best solution to Fagin might be to travesty him and to make him the juiciest part in a Broadway musical. Fiedler never imagined that the association of Jews and vampires might be turned into camp burlesque. The action of Roman Polanski's 1967 horror comedy, The Fearless Vampire Killers, is set in and around an Eastern European krechme, or roadhouse. Characters dress in old-world clothing, and the innkeeper and his wife make regular use of the word nu and the sound oi. In the movie's most famous scene, the Jewish innkeeper, having been turned into a vampire, preys on a blonde Gentile woman. She tries to ward him off with a cross, to which the Jewish vampire responds, "Oi, have you got the wrong vampire?" This is a real movie. The movie's twin goals were to travesty the serious vampire movie, but also to ridicule the culture that birthed intolerance of the Jew, the heir of Eastern European superstition. Now, camp was also the approach taken by filmmakers of A&E's 2000 made-for-TV version of The Great Gatsby that I mentioned before. In a development that I assume would have delighted Leslie Fiedler, the Jewish director Robert Markowitz decided to emphasize the homoerotic tension between Gatsby and Nick Carraway. The movie opens with Carraway narrating over a shot of Gatsby in his pool. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him. And Carraway pauses and lingers over the word gorgeous. Later, when Gatsby and Nick finally meet at Gatsby's party, after making eyes at each other from across the room, Jordan Baker interrupts them and says, "Having a gay time now." Yet perhaps the most aggressive thematic change to the material was the decision to cast Paul Rudd as Nick Carraway. Paul Rudd, a Jewish actor, was in his awkward stage between Clueless and the Judd Apatow movies at this point. And he can barely stifle the slightly awkward, slightly nerdy, slightly befuddled projection of Jewishness that would come to define Jewish masculinity in early 21st century America. Here is how Rudd reacts to Wolfsheim. The slide doesn't really do the reaction any justice. Wolfsheim's response is best characterized as a kind of knowing nod. Rudd's movements and body language say, oh, maybe we should listen to what this guy says, not, Wolfsheim doesn't belong here. Paul Rudd basically plays Nick Carraway as a schlemiel. Now, the A&E Gatsby is likewise the only one to feature a truly villainous Wolfsheim. Its Wolfsheim is physically marked as Jewish. A series of close-up highlight the actor Grayson's and therefore Wolfsheim's one peculiar feature, his large ears. Moreover, the director clearly asked Grayson to play Wolfsheim with full-throated evil. Grayson speaks with gravel in his mouth. The nasal qualities of Fitzgerald's dialogue have given way to the gruff pulp villain. Grayson even succeeds in steadily elevating the threat in his voice, making Wolfsheim more odious as the scene progresses. This culminates, as it should, at the moment that Wolfsheim shows Carraway his cuff buttons, made from the finest specimens of human molar. Now, the glint of Grayson's eyes combines with the camera angle to actually make Wolfsheim seem menacing. It's a very hammy stage menace, but we really believe that Carraway could recoil from Wolfsheim. And this is the only adaptation where that effect is even partly preserved. But it's also telling that the Jew is only allowed to be evil in a movie that tells us not to take it too seriously. So I want to pause here to think about what we've seen so far. I said at the outset that the story of the Jewish villain mixed different fears and points of pride. Meyer Wolfsheim represents anti-Jewish prejudice. He represents us with the fear of continuing to be seen as a corrupter and an enemy of the faith, even in secular America. But Wolfsheim also embodies a particular Jewish fear, the fear of not passing, that is, the fear of trying to gain admission and of still being excluded. Hyman Roth is, for all intents and purposes, the stereotypical Jewish villain of Western tradition. All of the stereotypes associated with the Jew combine to make Roth the ultimate screen villain. But this almost makes him more exciting to watch. The mark of the true villain is his ability to get under the skin of both the hero and the audience. Now, it's worth noting that later portrayals of Lansky work to mitigate the story of Hyman Roth. Ben Kingsley's version of Lansky and Bugsy rewrote him, humanized him. Meyer Lansky repeatedly says that Bugsy Siegel's problem is that he doesn't respect money. Now, the line has a vague resemblance to Roth's quote, "This is the business we've chosen," but it speaks to a different impulse. Roth's quote reinforced our sense that money was his highest source of meaning. Lansky's line in Bugsy is the highest expression of empathy. It represents Lansky's decision to try and understand his friend, to respect the fact that Siegel is a fundamentally different person. Lansky uses this line to plead for his friend's life. By the time Lansky does order Siegel's death, the act takes on the shape of mercy. It is the final thing that he could do for a friend who watched all of his dreams disappear. But by far the most provocative take on Lansky is Zachary Lazar's 2014 novel, I Pity the Poor Immigrant. Lazar's book is easily one of the most beautiful and most frustrating of recent American Jewish novels. It is a pseudo-memoir about a woman journalist named Hannah who gets involved in the lives of other people. It also contains fake newspaper articles, extended book reviews, and scenes that can only be described as short fiction, entries from an unwritten novel about the life of Meyer Lansky. As the author-protagonist tells us, her project becomes a story that led elsewhere, a story that led everywhere, a story that I would have had no interest in if I hadn't accidentally found myself inside it. At times, Lansky is the central character. At times, he is simply a pretext. The author-journalist who writes the pseudo-memoir we are reading knows that we only started reading the book because of its promise to tell us the true story of Lansky. And of course, the movie contains its own version of the scene at the airport. All the FBI had to do once he'd boarded in Buenos Aires was to keep him on the plane all the way to its terminus, America. 36 hours in transit, stops in 7 countries. They met him at Miami International and drove him to the FBI office downtown, where his lawyer went out to get him a piece of bread and some milk for his ulcers. So In the pictures, we saw Lansky weary at the airport, but the addition of these final details, the lawyer and the act of mercy of getting him some milk for his ulcers, that really resonate, that really turn this not just of a story of existential pain and cosmic suffering, but one into real physical agony that we can relate to. Late in the novel, Lansky explains his plight. He understood by then how much they needed him to be their monster, how secure it made them feel in their righteousness. Now, I want to wrap up right now with a few final thoughts and a final image. First, The Tale of Two Meyers is in part the story of Jews learning how to tell their own story. Meyer Wolfsheim is the fantasy of a Jew, a caricature of prejudice, not a real person. Fiedler's essay came in 1949. It came at the start of the era in which American Jews began to assertively tell their own stories and put the American Jewish experience at the center of the literary map. The next decade saw the rise of Alfred Kazin, Saul Bellow, and Philip Roth. Other major American Jewish writers followed. Jews learned to feel comfortable telling their stories, and the Jew became the representative of a shifting America, the figure for America in crisis. Second, I think Fiedler has largely been proven correct. The image of the Jewish villain hasn't disappeared, nor will it, nor perhaps do we want it to. We've instead surrounded it with dozens of counter-images. We've grown more comfortable with repurposing the figure of the Jewish villain. We've made the Jewish villain a symbol of strength, and we've used it to attack stereotypes of the Jew. Lazar's version is perhaps the best version of this, but there are many significant others. The final image that I want to show you today comes from Will Eisner's 2003 graphic novel, Fagin the Jew. Eisner is one of the most important and innovative figures in the history of comics. Eisner actually has a rather nuanced vision of stereotypes in art. He believes that it is okay for the cartoonist to draw a stereotypical figure as a way of easily identifying his origins, but he also recoils at using cartoons to foment racism. Fagin the Jew came after a detailed study on the history of caricatures and racial prejudice. Eisner decided to replace the caricature of Fagin with a visual depiction that he felt better represented Fagin's Ashkenazic origins. But the most radical change is the narration. In Eisner's version, Fagin narrates his story to a man in the shadows, a man whose face is obscured by darkness. The man in darkness is posed like the classic comic book villain. And at the end, we find out that the man in the darkness is Charles Dickens. And the story ends with Fagin accusing Dickens. Artists and writers have always described for us whom we fear and whom we trust. You and your kind, therefore, are responsible for the endurance of bias, in this case against Jews. Here, Eisner uses a character maligned by the artist to argue against the power of art. He is the Jew saying, I may be a villain, but you've made me the source of eternal evil. Here is the Jew demanding that writers and artists be responsible, that they write with full understanding of what they do. Here is the Jewish artist also telling us why he makes art and why he speaks on behalf of his people. Third, as I said at the beginning, this story is ongoing. The Jewish gangster is only one type of Jewish villain. We're still learning how to respond to what it represents, at once the embodiment of prejudice, but also, oddly, a sign of what we've overcome. But there's still an important aspect of the story that we tend to omit: money. Lazar's Meyer Lansky isn't wealthy. He doesn't possess a huge fortune. Lazar's Lansky really does appear to live life with a limited income. Hyman Roth had money as one of his only motivations. Everything became subordinated to the logic of money and business. There's nothing particularly Jewish about this. We're always asked to decide if work is more important than family and how to balance our time. But there's no denying that it is the stereotype of the Jew, and that this is part of the story that we still are reluctant to tell. This fear, not any religious fear, is the one that still drives us today and haunts us. The image of the Jew who controls the economy still exerts too strong a force in our lives. Bernard Madoff was the most notorious Jewish villain of the last decade, but up until now, art has basically treated him with silence. That the largest victims of his crime were Jewish is almost immaterial. The crime still cuts too close to the bone to want to make it popular entertainment. But I'll close on something more positive. Art's great power is the ability to make us imagine the world in ways that we'd never before considered, to make us think that we've learned something new about what it means to be human. The fact that we've been able to see so many nuances in the story of Meyer Lansky is truly exceptional, an unbelievable achievement. It shows that at least some of us are able to see him as a person and a father, a Jew and a villain, both at the same time, but not as a Jew villain. We look at Lansky, we look at the Jew, and we see the human being.
Okay, we have now about 20 minutes for questions. I'll be fielding the questions. Valeria will be bringing the microphone to you. So if you've got the microphone, you've got the question. We'll go with Alan first.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. We've been talking about Lansky largely through his portrayals in popular culture. And the question I wonder about is how he himself related to his celebrity. I actually lived in Miami growing up.
Right.
And he lived under the radar. I mean, everyone knew he was there, but he lived in a fairly simple home. His habits were not extravagant. He did not do a lot to draw attention to himself, indeed the opposite. And yet he is a person of such extraordinary charisma in all of these portrayals. And he insisted to the end of his life that he was a small fry and not rich, and certainly did not live an opulent life. So I'm curious how these come together between the reality and the extraordinary portrayals that you showed us.
Thank you. That's a great question. The easiest way to answer that question is that we have no understanding of Meyer Lansky's life. We really have no access to what could be the truth of it. A lot of the biographies rely on information that we now know was sort of added by early pulp journalistic writers. That a lot of the stories that we took to be true about Lansky are really unreliable at their core. We do know that he shunned the spotlight. This is absolutely true. Meyer Lansky wanted to stay out of prison. Meyer Lansky had no interest in being a celebrity target and being under he did not want to appear before House committees as other mobsters had to do. Meyer Lansky did whatever he could to stay out of the public limelight, and because of that, we know so little about him. And it also leaves us with an intriguing question. We end up having to decide between two totally contradictory things. We can either see the Lansky who lived in this modest house in South Florida. It has my favorite little note is the fact that he drives rented Chevrolets. I think this is somehow perfect to this creation of a public image of a retiree on a pension. We can either see this and say that this in some way represents the truth of reality, which is, I think, where Lazar went in his book, and say that Lansky did not die with a massive fortune. He was not worth $400 million, as some imagined, back when $400 million was an even greater sum of money. But instead, he retired with a few $1 million to his name, most of which was not really able to be given away to his children because it was squirreled away in various bank accounts. That is a way to interpret Meyer Lansky. But I think that we also it's problematic if we don't try and imagine what it would mean to acquire those hundreds of millions of dollars, right? What it says about Lansky the person to want to do that.
One other bit that's a bit poignant that you didn't highlight in the talk, my recollection from Israel's decision is that in the background is that Lansky was one of those individuals involved at the formation of Israel and in the War of Independence in using the mob to get weapons to Israel. So in fact, he did have a prior relationship and was important.
There's a lot of legends surrounding the mob in early Israel that are a little hard to find the truth there. One thing that we do know is completely true is the Nazi collaborators had invaded the major American ports in the early 1940s. And there was a lot of industrial sabotage of naval vessels and other sorts of ships. So the Navy decided to reach out to the mafia, who they knew had been involved with the longshoremen's unions and controlled a lot of the docks. And they asked the mafia to get involved in policing the docks. And after that, German industrial sabotage basically stopped. So I don't know what exactly Lansky's role might have been with Israel, but he was certainly in his own way involved with the war effort. And Lansky brokered that deal with Lucky Luciano and the Navy.
I was thinking, we've talked a lot here about context. So if we're talking about Gatsby in the 1920s, we're talking about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. We're talking about the communist threat. We're talking about the rise of the Soviet Union, the anti-communist Red Scare in the United States. Jew and communists were considered equals back then, as well as the McCarthy. But so you're going to have to, I have this problem with the concept of villain. They had to paint the Jew in the 1920s as the villain.
Yes.
Yet whereas Lansky, as you showed in your quote from Tough Jews, was really heroic to those of us who remember the Jewish powerlessness of the 1930s and 40s. Here was a Jew. We're studying the Irgun, the Haganah,
Right.
the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Meyer Lansky, breaking up the Bund in the Madison Square Garden in the late 30s, early 40s, and so on. So therefore, villain, I'm not sure that I would have described him as such, but that's...
Well, I use the term villain in part because that is the literary role that Lansky is playing in almost all of these texts. Only in Lazar's book would we say that Lansky is the hero of the story. And even then, we'd really struggle to call him the hero of the story. He's sympathetic in Bugsy. He's not really the hero or the villain. He's in between. But there's no question that in The Godfather Part 2, that Hyman Roth is really the true villain. Now, you could say Michael is also a villain, so they're both villains. But they are playing that literary role. But I want to get back to what you said initially about the context of the 1920s. Because what's interesting is you can still see how stereotypical the portrayal of Wolfsheim is in The Great Gatsby. The text is still very clear. But if you read it at the moment in time, all of these other things that you talk about would have been in your mindset. All of these things would have been there. You wouldn't have to work on it. You would imagine the Protocols of Elders of Zion. You would have imagined the communist threat. That's one of the ironies about Jews, is that we're somehow associated both completely with the evils of capitalism and with the evils of communism. And they all would have been brought to bear on the same page by the reader who went to that. So yes, it's true that he was clearly a role of villain. But I think that what's so interesting is who society labels as a villain and who we call it can often be read as this symbol of power and can often be reinterpreted for the humanity to understand. That we can now see people like Lansky, who at the time would have been written about in all the pulp magazines for the massive crime that had been going on in the streets that surrounded Prohibition, that we could see these people as figures of heroism.
And yet, when this popular PBS series called The Jewish Americans was aired, how many years ago? 7 years ago, I think. The Lanskys and Bugsy Siegel and all of those were presented as heroes in juxtaposition to kids being beaten up. And the community took them as heroes for that very reason. So it's the difference between how we as a Jewish community saw it versus the outsiders, but also how we're still portraying it today to the outside world. So we're still partly outsiders, even though we're insiders.
Right. What I would fixate there, though, is the question of time and when these things happened. That in the 1920s, maybe they would not have been regarded as symbols of strength. That's not the contemporary attitude that you would find. You don't see that. You don't see sensationalism of gangsters in the American Yiddish press. We don't have novels celebrating this sort of more muscular attitude towards protecting Jewishness. This wasn't an attitude that we find bandied about in American popular culture. It's an attitude that comes about later, where retroactively we're now looking back at these people and saying, we respect the fact that you had to do these things, that you turned to violence to protect yourself, and that you turned to violence to fight your way into the business that was keeping you out. So it's very much a thing that we can now do. Rich Cohen's here almost as a primary source. The fact that we now have this attitude, which was gone, which was not a part of the dialogue years earlier. But it's also, I will say, there's an irony because we sometimes have a willingness to romanticize the past, the criminal past, and to wish it away. And we can say that we had these wonderful, tough Jews, while also being uncertain about what to do with what faces us in the present. Yes?
I was stimulated to think about another one that's a little bit more contemporary, and that's the figure in the Sopranos TV series, Heshe, whatever his name was. And it seems to me, I'm not sure where you would put him in your typology, but I think we see him as a family man. We see, first of all, we've got Tony Soprano as, the hero, and obviously he's doing all those murders, and it's sort of like we're regularized to have one of those kind of guys too.
Right.
And so maybe that's another response is to...
Hesh Rabkin is a very interesting character. I like him quite a bit. He's sort of there in the early seasons, a little bit like Howard Da Silva's Meyer Wolfsheim. He's this sort of guy who's from the old days, who they like to have around and they have fun with. But the real action of Hesh's villainy, as the show presents it to us, is there's an episode in the first season where Hesh is described as we learn that he was a record producer and that he had put his name on all of these works that were written by black artists. So if you were here this morning, this was exactly the types of thing that had come up. And on the show, this is almost presented as his sort of criminal bona fides, right? This is one of the things that he did. The other thing is, what is the main role that Hesh plays on The Sopranos? What is his actual criminal behavior? He's a Shylock. He loans money at interest, right? That's the term that the mob uses for these things, to shy. Yeah.
So this morning, Ben Sidran ended his talk by speaking about post-ethnic America and the idea that his children wouldn't have the same connection to the Holocaust or to the tradition and so on. And here you are presenting the eternal Jewish villain. Do you find no solace in what he was suggesting, or how would you relate to Ben's point about, or not only Ben's, but the talk of post-ethnic America as far as the Jew is concerned?
I'll say this. What researching this topic has shown me more than anything else was just the massive divergence between America and the rest of the world when it comes to how we talk about Jews and how we are as a society. That there are sort of trace elements of anti-Semitism, and we have fears that perhaps it could percolate, but it doesn't come up in anywhere near the same way as it happens abroad. So if we just think about England, English literature, you still have, there was a controversy a couple of years ago because the British writer Alan Hollinghurst wrote a new novel where he has the most stereotypical Jewish villain, and it's used rather unreflexively. It's just this noxious Jewish man who is a bad landlord and fleeces people out of their money. And the problem wasn't that he used the character, the problem was that he never thought to consider it. It was just a stock trope from British literature that he was going to put in there in order to make his book a little bit more engaging. So that's, I think, what's really interesting to me. I think that this is a part of the American literary culture that Jews shouldn't be shy about embracing. What we need to embrace, however, is the premise of keeping the human first and not allowing something to just dwindle into the caricature that it could otherwise. Yes?
I'm just wondering about F. Scott Fitzgerald and his relationship with Hollywood. Was he a successful screenwriter? Did he ever achieve what he wanted there?
F. Scott Fitzgerald had a very problematic relationship in Hollywood. He went out to write screenplays. He was not especially successful, but he did work in Hollywood for a long time. And I'll say that Fitzgerald was a man of his time. He had what we would now sort of call a fashionable anti-Semitism, in that he betrayed the privilege of his class, who just thought of Jews as a sort of different, as a lesser group. It wasn't an active hate. And in Hollywood in the 40s, as he continued to live there, he had to really learn how to suppress that. And he tried to reevaluate his positions to Jews. But if you actually read his last novel, he doesn't succeed. His last novel has a Jewish hero, Monroe Starr, who's the head of a studio. But Starr is really the one good Jew in a series of awful Jews. That the other studio heads are almost described as dwarf-like and only care about money, whereas Starr has values of art and other things behind him. So anti-Semitism is almost more hardwired into that novel by the idea of acclaiming this one magnificent Jew than it is in The Great Gatsby, where it more plays thematic roles.
Okay, we're going to have our final question or comment from Tony Michaels. Hopefully this will be a friendly exchange.
A great talk. It was terrific. And I have a question about your comments on Hesh, which I thought were just really on target. My question is, what do you make of the fact that, on the one hand, as you pointed out, Hesh became wealthy by ripping off black singers, and I think this is roughly based on the owner of a Bronx record label, whose name just escaped me, who did just that. Right. But in the show, he's also at one point either married to a black woman or having a serious relationship with her. And that's an interesting, it struck me as an interesting detail, and I wonder what you think of it.
Yeah, I think one of the questions that The Sopranos raises is the one that came up in The Godfather 2, which was about interethnic mixing, and under what levels is it permissible and how. So one of the things that happens in the last season of The Sopranos is all of a sudden, when Tony's going through his crisis, he just cuts Hesh out. And he turns on him in a sort of very anti-Semitic way, that now they're done. He gets in debt to Hesh for gambling. And when he pays back Hesh, he acts as if he's not repaying a debt that he owes someone else. He's repaying this Jew who's lording this debt over him. So the line there is always very fragile in a lot of these things. And in fact, that's something that even came up in real life, where a lot of the Jewish gangsters, we don't think about it this way, but the mob was one of the first businesses to integrate. And link together people of very different backgrounds. And one of the most famous crime wars that ever happened in New York had to deal with older Sicilians who felt that only Sicilian stock should be involved in this and there should be no interethnic mixing, and we have to maintain the old ways. And this younger crop of Jewish and Italian gangsters who were working towards a more integrated crime future.
Okay, on that note, if you want to go into new industries, thank you, Eitan.